welcome everybody to this OGP event panel discussion on Disclose the Deal. How can the open government partnership boost contract disclosure in the extractive sector? My name is Elisa Peter. I am the Executive Director of Publish What You Pay, and I'll be your moderator today. We're pleased to co-host this event in partnership with the Natural Resource Governance Institute and Oxfam America as part of our global Disclose the Deal advocacy campaign for the comprehensive disclosure of all contracts relating to the extraction of oil, gas, and mineral resources. In most countries, when government resources, they make agreements with oil, gas, and mining companies to take these resources out of the ground. These agreements or contracts spell out the conditions and the respective rights and obligations of the companies and the state. Now, historically, most of these agreements remained confidential, but thanks to pressure by Publish What You Pay, our members, and our partners around the world, extractive contracts are now increasingly made publicly available. So what we're going to discuss today is three things. Number one, why is this important? Why is it important to disclose contracts to promote open and accountable governance in the extractive sector? Number two, what are some of the leaders in that field? And what are some of the remaining challenges? And finally, number three, how can OGP be leveraged as a tool to get more extractive deals disclosed out in the open? So I'm very privileged to have a really impressive panel today with me. Robert Pittman, Senior Governance Officer at the Natural Resource Governance Institute, NRGI. Meliana Lumbatorian, Program Manager at Publish What You Pay, Indonesia. Thank you, Meliana, for joining so late for you. Carla Flores-Lott, Researcher at Cartocritica in Mexico. Richard Morgan, Head of Government Relations and Political Risk at Anglo American. Nana Akua-Agei, Manager at the Legal Department of the Ghana Petroleum Commission. And then we also have Aubrey Maynard, who's Senior Policy Advisor for Extractive Industries Transparency at Oxfam America, who will deliver closing remarks at the end of this panel. Before I turn to our panelists, let me just highlight a couple of housekeeping points. There is interpretation on this panel in English and Spanish, so I will invite you to go to your language room at the bottom of the screen. We want to take as many questions from the audience as possible. And so for this reason, we really encourage you to post your questions in English or in Spanish in the chat box throughout the event. We are moderating that chat box for all the questions that you post to us to make sure that we use our limited time together the best possible way. So I will not be taking questions orally, just those in the chat box. And then finally, the session is being recorded. So please do mute yourself when you're not talking yourself. Great, so Rob, you're first in my firing line for questions. So you've been working on contract disclosure now in the extractive sector for several years. So from a global perspective, how would you assess the progress we've made so far? And what are the remaining challenges, and how can OGP help address those challenges?
Excellent. Well, first, thank you very much for having me, Elisa. It's a real pleasure to be here today and great to be talking about this exciting issue. So in terms of progress, the good news is that over the last year, we've seen the strong foundations of the norm of contract transparency further reinforced. There are now more public contracts than ever. Resource Contracts, the world's largest repository of publicly available oil, gas, and mining contracts, now hosts over 2,700 documents. Relating to international standards, we've seen further building on the 2019 requirement from EITI. This year, the new GRI sector standard for oil and gas covered contract transparency for the very first time. The full range of international organizations with policies and statements supporting contract transparency now includes the IMF, International Bar Association, the OECD, the UN, the IFC, MIGA, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, among others. And as this is happening, we're seeing more and more governments disclosing. There are now 49 countries that have officially disclosed at least one extractive industry contract, and 31 with policies in place making publication mandatory. So I've just said a ton of things that are really, really positive, but there is actually even more. Probably the most notable sort of set of changes actually relate to the private sector. Just this last week, we've seen the mining industry body called the ICMM announce that its 28 members have agreed to make a new commitment to publish contracts and contract transparency. And that takes the number of extractive companies with a public statement or policy on contract transparency up to 42. And just to put that in context, back in 2018, when Oxfam did their sort of assessment of company statements on contract transparency, that number was just 18. So huge change in the private sector. And one way that this commitment is really, really notable is it does focus on the actual sort of process of disclosing. And that's something that not many companies have actually committed to do. So this is really, really exciting. We'll expect to see a lot of movement there. Moreover, in instances where governments prohibit disclosure with a law or regulation, the ICMM members have committed to encourage governments to provide consent. And we've got we actually have an ICMM member on the panel today, so I'm going to be really interested to hear what Richard has to say about this exciting new policy. So that's all the progress. Obviously, you know, that's one side of things, and there are challenges ahead. And I want to highlight three. These are, firstly, that many important contract documents remain secret. The number of countries that have disclosed some contracts is quite high. As I said, it's 49. But the number of companies that disclose all of their contracts is actually much lower. We see only 24 have disclosed comprehensively in one sector, and just 7 have disclosed comprehensively in both sectors. So that's the first point. Many contract documents still remain secret. The second is that we're seeing a worrying implementation gap form around contract transparency. Just last week, NRGI published our latest resource governance index. And one of the things that the resource governance index does is it marks countries on their legal progress with laws and their implementation progress. And we're seeing that while both scores are improving, the legal progress is actually advancing at a faster rate than the implementation progress. And so that's something we really need to address. This cannot be normalized going ahead. The final challenge, I think, going ahead is just to remind ourselves that access to contracts is as important as ever with the energy transition. As we all know, the energy transition is transforming the extractive industries worldwide, with fossil fuel production set to decline and the extraction of critical minerals needed for green technologies set to increase markedly in the future. And in this context, people are going to need access to contracts to understand how these changes, external changes to the extractive industries, are going to impact the benefits and the challenges associated with extractive industry projects. Moreover, policy makers are going to need to access contracts to understand whether or not the provisions in contracts are actually tying their hands and preventing them from making policy that addresses the energy transition. There's a great NRGI brief by a colleague of mine, Nicola Woodruff, just published in the last couple of months that explores this challenge in great detail. So in terms of what the OGP can do, I think the very basic and obvious thing is OGP member countries can include a commitment on contract transparency in their national action plans. And they are already doing this to some degree. An OGP survey in 2019 identified that at least 10 OGP countries had used their OGP action plans to commit to contract transparency. And these commitments to contract transparency are one of the areas where most of the progress in OGP commitments has been made. I would just add that, in countries where there is a national EITI process, these OGP commitments can be mutually beneficial, raising the profile of the EITI process and its commitments, and also providing OGP with a ready national framework for the implementation of the policy via the EITI process. Thanks very much for this opportunity to speak. I'm really looking forward to what everybody else has to say, because there's some really exciting panelists here with us today. So yes, I'm ready to get stuck in and listen and answer questions as they come up. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob. That's great. Thank you for getting us started. So the 3 points I hear from your presentation is that contract disclosure in the extractive sector really has become a global norm, with countries and the private sector committing increasingly to contract disclosure. And we'll go to Richard in a minute to hear from the mining companies what the recent ICMM commitment to contract disclosure means. Number two, there's still room for improvement in terms of what parts of contracts are being disclosed, and an important implementation gap between policies and practices out there. And then number three, the importance, perhaps more than ever, of disclosing contracts in the context of the energy transition. So I think that's a great segue to our next speaker from Indonesia, Indonesia being a big coal producer. So Meliana, you joining us from Publish What You Pay Indonesia. Thanks again for staying up late in order to participate in this panel. Very much appreciated. So Publish What You Pay Indonesia is actively working in order to ensure that contracts from the extractive sector are disclosed. So that's mostly the mining sector in Indonesia. Could you please share with us why Publish What You Pay Indonesia want contracts to be published and how you go about getting them out? Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Elisa, for having Publish What You Pay initiation. We are really eager to share to you here. Yes, thank you for the question. The reason why the Publish What You Pay Indonesia sees that the contract disclosure is important and must be implemented in Indonesia, especially in the extractive sector, firstly is because actually Indonesia already have a clear legal umbrella regarding the contract disclosure. Actually, like in our constitution already state that people have right to information, right to participate in managing natural resources, and then Indonesia already have like a public information disclosure law, which is stated that the public bodies are required to open the contracts with the third parties. But although the public information disclosure law already explicitly stated that the contract or the licensing documents are open information, but in practical level, public still has difficulty to obtain the contract documents. In fact, if some of them succeed in getting the document, the process that goes through is can have more than 1 year to get the documents. So we thought that there is the lack of contract and license openness, which is we think that this is suspected as one of the reasons behind the bad governance in the mining permits in Indonesia, such as like overlapping the permits, mining in the conservation or protection area, and etc. No less important that this makes it difficult for the public to carry out the supervision because there is the absence of the key information regarding the licensing. The second one reason why Publish What You Pay Indonesia sees the contract disclosure is important, there's our government already involved and commit in the EITI and OGP, where the Indonesian government Indonesia is the member of the EITI, which is Indonesia have to comply to the EITI standard, one of which is to open the contract and permits in the extractive sector. And also in the OGP, the government Indonesia also required to develop the national action plan for their open government agenda, such as. Of course, we see that this is also the basis and the reason for us to encourage the contract disclosure, especially in the extractive sector, because these two initiatives both prioritize the principle of transparency and openness. So we try to include it that the extractive sector, especially about the contract transparency, have to be included on the EITI on OGP. The third one, besides the reason with for the clear legal umbrella and the commitment of the government from the openness initiative. Another reason that is also our concern is about contract disclosure is the benefits that will be obtained by the states and the government when the contract is open will be more than not opening the contract. We already know all that the contract disclosure will help the government to get the best deal on the natural resource management, because using the contract disclosure, we see that the negotiation or the agreement can be calculated better and have strong control and, of course, support from the public. And the second one we see, if we push the contract disclosure, this can prevent the corrupt practices in negotiating the contract. It means that with the contract disclosure, public can supervise, provide an assessment, like, for example, regarding the profit sharing or split.
Trato sa maggiore scrutinio.
Citizen can get like that. And of course, through the contract disclosure, we see that negotiation agreement not to be carried out in the private, because no suspicion or opportunities for corruption at all. And the last one that we see that the benefits that make us see that this is important, the contract disclosure is important, is if the contract is disclosed, it can make an open bigger space for the public participation, especially in monitoring and implementation of the contract. So if there is an issue related to the natural resource management regarding the enforcement of the contract contents, for example, regarding the tax obligation, the payment of the state revenue, or maybe environmental social standard and other aspects, it can make the public can encourage and government to manage, to improve the management of the natural resource management, including enforcing the contents of the contractual agreements. Yes, that's the three reasons I think make the public stewardship way Indonesia wants that the contract to be published. And at the end is, if the contract already published, it's still many steps to get along, like to get better governance, especially in the mining. So this is maybe like a small step, but it should be do one by one. Thank you, Elisa.
Great, thank you, Meliana. Really insightful information about Indonesia, which I remind everyone is both an OGP country and an EITI implementing country. So great opportunities for synergies here between the EITI commitment to contract disclosure and how that can be reinforced by commitments in the National Action Plan of Indonesia. And thanks for reminding us of all the benefits that contract disclosure has, including around anti-corruption and public participation, which are at the core of the Open Government Partnership. I'll come back to you later, Meliana, around the energy transition question, knowing that Indonesia is a large coal producer. There's a lot of coal mining going on, not now, but later. I'd like you to reflect about how contract disclosure can help a conversation at the domestic level, at the national level, around the phase out of fossil fuels and which projects to exploit and which ones may not be viable in the medium to long term. But before that, I'd like to turn to Carla Flores-Lott from Mexico. So we're going from Indonesia to Mexico. And By the way, please do ask questions in the chat box. The audience, you're all very much welcome to ask questions as we go in the chat box, and we'll take them in a few minutes once all the panelists have had a chance to say a few introductory words. So Carla, to you, when it comes to the publication of extractive contracts in Mexico, it seems like there's been good progress on the disclosure of oil contracts, but that there's still room for improvement in order to ensure that mining contracts are also made public. Next year, Mexico will co-create its new OGP National Action Plan. So I was curious to hear from you how civil society is planning to leverage this opportunity in the context of OGP to further advance contract disclosure in the mining sector in Mexico. Thanks.
Thank you. Hi, I'm very glad to be here and thanks for the invitation. But I'm going to speak in Spanish to be more accurate with my terms. Bueno, Elisa,
So Elisa, you're right that in the extractive industries, there is room to improvement. And not only that we didn't advance in transparency for the contracts, but we also had some setbacks. Actually, some public information disclosed has been removed, and the segregation is not on a base of project or per contract. It is disaggregated by company and is very spread out. So you cannot relate one place to each other, and the access is very difficult. So you need to have some expertise in information in order to locate this information. So for an average person, you cannot access this information. So the complex of these routes makes it opaque. And Robert has also mentioned about the advances on the EITI, but by the mining qualification of Mexico was very low. And it is true, it's true that in Mexico, the structure for the approval of licenses is very complex, because we do not talking about the administrative process for the approval of licenses. So you can have one single project with different approvals, but then the environmental licenses only relate to one specific project. So if you reveal the information on regards to those approvals, you don't have the information about the different stages of the developments in those mines. And this happens in a horizon in Mexico, where we also belong in the alliance, in the OGP, and also in the EITI. So we are an implementing country for EIT, and we have been 3 years, and also my organization have been advocating for 2 years already, 2019, 2020, and we have found these constraints from the mining industry to be transparent of their projects. We have also been advocating quite a lot during 3 years with technical groups in order to reveal the contextual information. So not only the workflow information or about the economic and financial information, but also the context going around it. So environmental, social, and genre. So what is the result? So up to date, we had to build up a report to complement the other reports already disclosed, because they decided not to disclose this information, this contextual information, along with the EIT information. So the advancement of this industry in Mexico is not so good. So in our 5th action plan, we want to propose an engagement of the energy and extractive industries in order to build up a portal where we can have all the information all together, centralized information, but not only centralized, but also we are used to remain in the approval surrounding. So once the contract is approved, then we can go and check on the accounting. So this has to be only an opening stage, because there are no engagements on this. So during the development of the project, we don't have any visual of the information. So we want this portal also to be used in order to follow up the every project. So all the information has to be real-time centralized in one portal, and also to show in which stage is this project. So we want to set up this transparency space for the public society. So we want to sit on the table with the different authorities, review an agenda of the needs of information that is useful not only for general public, but also for authorities, and then discuss, negotiate the possibility to make it public, and then having built up some monitoring groups, the same that we proposed from our organization. So these groups will work in parallel in order to follow up the if these engagements are being met. So this portal is a portal where different stakeholders can talk among each other. So there are many different instances altogether a project. So we don't want people to keep the information in a drawer. We want them to relate with each other. We need to build confidence. We need to fight corruption, because even if it's public, if information is not related, the stakeholder and information networks become so opaque and so difficult. So we want this space to be wide open with organized information. We can build this confidence, this trust space. We can also do the follow-up to those engagements. And this will be our proposal for OGP. Thanks, Elisa.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you. This was really full of ideas for the OGP National Action Plan that's going to be co-created next year. Thanks also for taking us down to a really concrete level about what it means to get contracts disclosed in a meaningful way, so that the general public, or as you said, even local authorities, really make use of the information in those contracts. And I think we're still far from it in Mexico and in other places that, as you say, Carla, disclosure is not the end of the story, right? It's about how we disclose in a way that's truly accessible for the intended parties. How do we make sure that this information is collated in one central place, in a registry, so that it can really benefit the citizens, the authorities, and ensure oversight of mining activities. So thanks. This was really, really helpful. So let me now turn to Richard Morgan, Anglo-American. Thanks, Richard, for joining us. So I want to come back to this announcement made by the International Council on Mining and Metals, ICMM, of which Anglo-American is a member, and which announced that it was now committing its 28 member companies to disclosing all the mineral development contracts that have been granted or entered into from the 1st of January this year, 2021. So Richard, could you share with us why ICMM has taken that step, and more specifically what that means for Anglo-American? And then perhaps, I mean, do you expect any challenges in implementing that decision from ICMM, either for Anglo-American or other member companies? Thanks.
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I mean, the first thing to say from our point of view, I think, is that open government partnership sums up exactly where the extractive industry needs to be. So I think there's absolutely no doubt in principle in my mind that certainly that's where companies like Anglo-American want to show a degree of leadership, because if we're going to get consensus around how monitored by everybody, and that's why transparency is very important. So hence my place on the board also of the EITI, and our work also with the Canadian-led thing on mining called the Intergovernmental Forum, IGF, which is about the same thing. How do you work progressive mining practices on that sort of three-way basis between government, mining sector companies and civil society? So look, absolutely really important in principle, which is why when the idea gets put from the EITI to ICMM as a progressive membership of 28 companies, feels it's got to show it's up to that challenge. That's the reason why the agreement went through. It's a bit late to say so now, but contract transparency does set off certain alarm bells in commercial companies' minds, because they think, why would I disclose something that's commercial? And I know that's a whole subject in itself, but that made its passage through the ICMM perhaps more difficult than it might have been, on the basis that, well, what does that mean? And we're still quite a lot of, we're talking about challenges, and it's going to be a progressive journey of that, I am sure, is because, well, do you disclose? And what's useful to be disclosed? Because when I talk to our teams about this, who are all signed up in principle and are from the chief executive down, keen to see this go through, it's, well, what do we show? Take South Africa. I mean, our footprint, very largely Southern Africa, Chile, Peru, Brazil. We were in Colombia, we're moving out of that now, but countries where you've got a degree of rule of law and independent sort of civil society voice. So those are important ingredients so that you can get the debate going. Interestingly enough, of course, Brazil, South Africa, Chile, not members of EITI. That would be a goal for us, would be to get them in there. And we can talk about what strengths EITI has and what weaknesses if we have time. But the point about contract transparency is that I'd almost rather it was called license disclosure, because I think disclosure is really important as part of the earning the trust around, is it a fair deal? That's what it comes down to really, is do enough people feel that what we're doing is a fair deal for the country? And that goes right across the ESG spectrum. And for the G part of it, you have this mine, it produces roughly this amount of whatever product it is, and you're paying this much to government. Is that fair? And the government then has to say, yes, we get this much and this is what we do with it. That of course, is the ideal conversation you need to have. We need to pitch it, obviously, to other countries as well, so that while it works for us, even whether they're EITI members or not in South Africa or in Brazil or in Chile, clearly with the, and it's a good link through, I suppose, to the new energy transition. I mean, we are moving out of, I mean, for those who don't know Anglo American, basically it's a sort of full range of portfolio mining company, from diamonds and platinum group metals, as you like, at the most precious end, through copper, iron ore, nickel, and through traditionally to the two types of coal. We've sold out of the thermal coal now, and we've still got some of the metallurgical coal that makes steel in Australia. We recognize the pressure on that. We also recognize the opportunity as a mining company on certainly copper. Quite a lot of the platinum group metals have got a future in, well, we hope, in hydrogen and the fuel cell future. So there's a whole massive incentive for us to do that. And also our scope 3 emissions declaration commitments. South Africa very heavily dependent on coal-fired power stations. If we can set up photovoltaic, and if they can break up the monopoly of power in South Africa, not power, but electric power in South Africa, how you can actually then help in a really contributive way, setting up solar PV cells, creating hydrogen, that should all be declared, and it should be really seen as a way forward. So I think there is definitely mileage in all this. The question is, what exactly do we mean by contract transparency? So South Africa, a mining license for us. Most of our areas have got mining codes, so it's not as if we have separate contracts anyway. You have a license to do something, and we should declare that. There are 4 parts to mining license in South Africa. Do we try and declare all 4 parts or not? Do we just do 2 or 3, and which bits are commercially confidential, which bits aren't? That's the question that we'll, as it were, need help with and need to talk through. I've spoken to Corruption Watch South Africa, who we partner with on a few things, and they say, actually, look, you guys aren't the problem. The problems, you know, some of the little ones you can't see where the beneficial ownership comes in and what's going on. So let's work together to try and make sure there's some degree of level playing field. That's really where my heart is, and commitment will remain over the next, well, for as long as I'm around with Anglo American.
Thanks, Richard. That's really helpful to hear your perspective from Anglo on those issues. And what I'm hearing is that you think that transparency is good in principle. It's also good for business. It's good for the social license to operate of mining companies, to earn the trust for, complying with your ESG commitments, to showing citizens of a country where you operate that you've struck a fair deal with their government. But I would say, from what I hear, is that there's still some outstanding questions, and maybe the devil is in the detail, right? It's about what you disclose, to whom, and why, and what's important to disclose. Keeping in mind that there's still concerns among some mining companies about commercial sensitivity or confidentiality clauses. So we can come back to that. I'm sure Rob will have some comments on that. But so before I open the floor to questions from the audience and follow-up comments from the panelists, let me turn to our last panelist, who's joining us from Ghana. So Nana Akua, thank you so much for joining us from the Ghana Petroleum Commission. So it's really important to have you as part of this conversation representing a government entity, because ultimately it is the host governments of countries where mining and oil extraction happens. It is the governments that set the rules by which extractive industry projects are run. So Ghana is a really interesting example because it recently made it a regulatory requirement to publish contracts, and has since produced a public-facing website, the Ghana Petroleum Register, where citizens from Ghana and the rest of the world can really browse and monitor projects and find contracts and all the related contextual information. So now, can you tell us why the government of Ghana decided to do this, and what advice you would share with government officials in other countries that are grappling with the decision of whether or not to publish those types of extractive contracts? Thanks.
So thank you, Alisa, for having me on this very important forum and to speak on this quite, should I say, sticky but fast transforming, issue in the oil, upstream oil and gas sector. And firstly, I'll say Ghana, fundamentally believes in transparency, and therefore, you realize that from the national level, there's a law that's passed, that's a law that says the right to information, which, gives everybody access to any information, concerning government business that is available or has become available in any ministry, department, or agency. So you realize that this allows for transparency in government business. And I'm sure, maybe you would have heard of panelists, or maybe even some of the participants would allude to the fact that, in Ghana, access to, should I say, a public official, minister, a chief executive, to ask any question, ranging from the minutest or, to the most sticky or controversial, question, it's not bad in any office. So the whole state runs an open governance, sort of mechanism to deal with citizenry and anybody interested in doing business. Secondly, I'll say that because of this tenet, Ghana is a member of the EITI. And so obviously, we buy into transparency issues. So from those principles, open door, open governance, transparency, you realize that it wasn't too difficult to now get into the step to publish, contracts or agreements or, any supporting documentations, concerning the oil and gas sector. So like you mentioned earlier, we have a dedicated website, which is the Ghana Petroleum Register, that anybody can access. And it has everything about the contracts. We see this as a transparency tool, which does, two-pronged. It deals with the citizenry and it deals with the investor. So on the citizenry side, the citizens, oil or gas, or should I say a natural resource in any country is a very topical and very sticky issue when it comes to the citizens, because they feel some kind of ownership to it. So they demand that they know what's happening. So if you don't, release that kind of information, then you create problems. So we see it as a good marketing, or should I say transparency tool, to get to the citizens, to also, it actually mitigates any anxieties, any, should I say, suspicions that the citizens may have, when it comes to giving out what, if I may say, belongs to them. And then on the other hand, also, when it's published, you create, it actually creates, apart from marketing and attracting investment, you create a level playing ground. So the investor coming in knows that I won't be treated any differently or, too differently from any other person that's going to come in. So it's sort of a tool that also attracts the investors. I'll say that, for governments, or should I say, governments or jurisdictions that are grappling with whether to publish or not, it's like I just said, it will save them a lot of agitations from the citizens. And the industry, the petroleum industry is such that when you have too much agitations, it affects, fundamentally the revenue that anybody is expecting. And of course, it does not protect the investor, because then the investors, the whole setup is disrupted. I don't want to, veer too much into that, but, all kinds of unwanted or unwarranted, should I say, incursions into operations. So you avoid all those things when you publish. And to be honest, it does not drive away any investor. It actually, on the other hand, attracts investors to come in, because any serious investor would want to see some kind of transparency and also know what they're buying into. So it's always good to make sure that, everything that you have to offer is put out there through the contracts that you've dealt with other companies or the likes. So I think that's what I'll say for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Nana Akua. It's so important to hear from governments such as yours in Ghana about why you also think transparency is good in principle, but also some of the complicated challenges that you're facing as a government in regards to contract disclosure. And I really like I might quote you in the future on that sticky but fast transforming issue. I think that's exactly what we're talking about. It's still a sticky, but it's a fast transforming issue, that of contract disclosure in the extractive sector. So thanks a lot for that. Before I turn to the questions from the audience, and thanks, please keep them coming, I wanted to give an opportunity to Rob first to comment on what Richard from Anglo-American said about this question that still and has been, but continues to be a difficult one around the commercial sensitivity or confidentiality clauses that some of those contracts have. How do we deal with that? And I think that's an issue not just for Anglo-American, but for a lot of mining and oil companies and for some governments, to be honest. So that's one thing I'd like Rob to respond. And then I'd like to go to both Indonesia and Mexico. So Meliana and Carla. One of the things Richard asked also is like, what needs to be disclosed? Those contracts are long, they have many amendments and annexes and different clauses. In theory, in principle, I think what we heard from Nana and Richard is that companies and governments might be happy to disclose all or most of that information, but what is it that communities, groups on the ground, or local authorities, those stakeholders in the mining and oil sector, what information do they really need from those contracts? What is it that's really important to be disclosed? So from your experiences both in Mexico and Indonesia, it'd be really interesting to hear your points of view and perhaps examples of how groups on the ground have used information in the contracts to find out answers to important questions they had in relation to a particular project. So first, let's go to Rob. Thanks. And then we'll turn to the questions from the audience.
Thanks, Elisa. Yes, so this issue of commercially confidential information is a really, really interesting issue. To some degree, one could say that almost any information relating to a project is of commercial consequence. In the if one company is providing more information than their competitors, then that information could put them at a commercial disadvantage in that they are more exposed because they're providing more information than other companies. And I think that that's where this is the big challenge. I think that for many companies who are trying to do the right thing here, this is the challenge they're facing, because if they do the right thing, then it means that some sort of fly-by-night company that doesn't want to disclose and wants to keep things secret isn't sort of exposing themselves to the same degree, and that puts them at the advantage. And so this is why I think it's really important for countries to actually make it mandatory to disclose, because then it puts everybody at the level playing field, and it means that the best companies are not put at a disadvantage. So that's one thing I would say. The other thing, and I think it relates a little bit to the second part of the question and that you asked, Carla, but I'll just, if it's okay, I'll just sort of answer it a little bit, is in order to work out what we want to disclose and what should be disclosed, there's this idea of a public interest test. This is quite a standard sort of idea in sort of freedom of information sort of jurisprudence. And the idea is that you have to weigh up the sort of commercial sensitivity against the public interest of making something public. And I think that is actually the way that you answer that in some ways is through sort of public debate on these issues. And we've seen in the extractive industries, there's been a huge sort of movement of the dial. 20-30 years ago, the idea that contracts would ever be published was absolutely ludicrous. Now everybody sort of understands that, well, there's several public interest reasons to publish contracts. They contain tax terms, they contain environmental, social information, they contain sort of information about labor rights, all sorts of, they even include information on gender. I just wrote a blog about that. So there's lots of reasons to publish, and it's about, we need to have a public debate and we need to keep that going, and I think that's why sort of forums like OGP and EITI, where we can all get around the same table, civil society, governments, and companies, are really, really important for this to further that discussion. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Rob. And so one of your recommendations is to make contract disclosure a mandatory requirement in the legislation of the country. So I think, Meliana, you said that actually contract disclosure is in the constitution of Indonesia, right? It is a requirement in the constitution that contracts should be made public. Is that correct?
Yes, it's not in the constitution, but in the public information disclosure law.
Right, right. So, but so coming back to the question about, so yes, we should disclose anything that's in the public interest. I mean, do you have like specific demands, as published by Indonesia about things that have not been in the public domain and would be really helpful, especially I'm thinking here for communities impacted by mining in Indonesia. And if you could give us an example of when, if and when that type of information is disclosed, how it has been used to increase accountability in the sector.
Yes, as I stated before, that one of the problem in Indonesia extractive sector is about there is overlapping permits like that, especially on the mining concession. So I think the data that's really need to be open from the contract is about the area, you know, like because it speaks to be the problem. So there will be no overlapping permits. And the second one, I think that the data that really important to be published is about related to the revenue, such as the amount of the production and the taxes that maybe the private sector can pay to the government. Even in EITI report also we can see that, but not all the public can see the EITI report. So the third one, that the data that we also want to looking up like the percentage or the split between the private sector and also the government, because this is also impact to the revenue sharing to the community, I think. So public want to know the split between the government and the company, and so the community can ask their what should they get from the extraction that occurs in their village or maybe their area like that. And yeah, I also want to highlight that Robert also said before, because in Indonesia also there is a debate, is that the contract can be disclosed or not, especially in the extractive sector, because we have an experience actually that extractive sector, there is still much debate whether the contract is an agreement between the private sector can be open or not. But in the fact that the several company has started to disclose their contract information through, but not the entire the whole contract, I think. So yeah, maybe the thing that we have to be propose the government to open is about that all data. And the things that I want to also highlight is the most important is information, how it relates to the environmental impacts. It's also really important to open, because when something wrong has happened in the area, the mining area and concession, can this time you can, if you know from the contract that there is what is the responsibility that the company should do, we can get it from the contracts maybe, and then we can ask the government to make the company want to responsible for that. Yes, that's my point, Alice.
Thanks, Meliana. And just on that last point, it is my understanding that actually often environmental impact assessments that are produced before a particular project goes ahead are not always made public, right? Is that the case also that you've experienced in Indonesia? So even before a project goes ahead, citizens and affected communities don't necessarily have access to the environmental impact assessment.
Yes, you're right.
Yeah. Great. So let's go to Mexico. Carla, there were a couple of, so I want to go back to that question about what needs to be disclosed, like, right? There's so many different types of information in those contracts. And I think it'd be interesting for the governments and the companies to kind of understand better what is it that citizens really want to be disclosed in terms of information. So if you could speak to that, and how also, you know, citizen participation can be enhanced through conversations around contracts once they're disclosed. Thanks.
Sí, claro. Pues tenemos muy
Yes, of course. We have very identify the needs that we want to boost in the next years. One of them, and I think is the most important, is that we hope that government and industries have a more political will on the part of the government, both in the OGP and in the EITI, but we found that there is these obstacles that if the legislation is not requiring that, I'm not disclosing. So there is we don't have this proactive disclosure. They are excusing themselves that this is not on the legislation, etc., etc. As regards the requirements by the EITI, EITI says many times that many of the requirements are recommendations. So this for the companies is like, okay, there is no obligation, this is a recommendation. So they just comply with the mandatory requirements, but those requirements that are just recommendations are virtually ignored. So we look for more political will to solve this problem, this issue. And another thing that we consider that is very needed is that the disclosure should be made a case for case, by project, because this prevent bad practices. In the case of, for example, of mining, we don't have access to the project. So we find stages in the project that are not identified in the monitoring of this project in the soil and abandonment stages of miners are not very well identified in the projects. So we found many environment liabilities because of that. So we should, if this is not disaggregated by project, we cannot get this accountability. Another thing that we expect to an improvement is the
la divulgación de información está concentrada en la información está concentrada
The information is focused in the financial flows. So we would love that there is a will in order to also disclose contextual information. And there is this very controversial situation where you deliver information using templates by each project, but we are signing NDAs in an exercise of transparency. So the information is only aggregated per company. So we jump into the integrated system with easy access. So we believe that it's urgent now that different entities talk to each other, different stakeholders. Even information is generated from different sectors. And in environmental topics, that is our concern, we are talking about article number 3 of ISCASU agreement. So trying to get this unified environmental directory of information, so we can avoid those flaws. We can avoid those gaps in information, talking about the different stages in the development of projects. And I believe that those are mainly the different topics, or the different points that we believe OGT and EITI will be developing, so to get better results. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Carla. So I'll now turn to the questions that we've received from the audience. The one that I'll take first is a question from Publish What You Pay Madagascar. And I think it's a really interesting one, because this conversation around contract disclosure gets technical very quickly. So usually you have some large NGOs discussing with government officials, usually in the mining or petroleum ministries, and in the context of the EITI with mining or oil companies. And it can be a very elitist and technocratic conversation. So the question we have here from Publish OGP Madagascar is around how do we popularize this? Like, how do we create a truly public demand from citizens for contract disclosure? And what they say here is people power can be a great pressure for pushing things forward quickly. But the fact is that in Madagascar, and I think I add in many other places, people do not seem to be very concerned about contract disclosure. So I'd like to throw this question to all of you. I think they're relevant for all of us engaged in that agenda. So, whether you're a government official, a company, or an NGO, how do we make sure that this demand for contract disclosure is meaningful and represents what the public really wants? And is that what the public wants, I guess? So it's the question, I think, is about how we democratize that conversation and make it less technical, get it out of the boardroom, get it out of the ministry's room, and make it about what OGP is all about: public participation and openness and a way to fight corruption. Nana, maybe I'll go for you. Like in Ghana, for instance, do you feel there's a grassroots public demand for contract disclosure in the petroleum sector?
Well, I'll say initially in the early stages, we had, that agitation and edge to see what was in the contracts and all of that. I'm not sure if publishing it has diffused it, but, generally the interest has gone down. But I'm inclined to believe that it's because they have confidence. They know what's happening. There's nothing that's a secret. And then because we have quite a very vibrant local content, forum that speaks to all these issues. So there's always some interaction or interface with the regulator and the citizen. So it's, I think the issue to do with, what the interest, or should I say that the disclosure will be that interface or the constant interaction. Once there's diffusion of information, there's no need for anybody to worry anymore. And so you realize that apprehension that, some governments will have or some private investors will have, it goes away, because then you don't have that, nobody's lurking in the dark and they're not sort of, should I say, sharp-eared anymore, because they have some confidence of what's happening in the industry. So we don't really have that agitation anymore. In the initial stages, they wanted to know how much are we getting, but once they understand the industry also. See, from the Ghana perspective, it's also to do with whether there's availability of technology, whether you have the staff to do the work, what you're putting in, so that you sort of minimize, expectations. So once they understand what the industry is actually about, then there's no issue with, are you doing the wrong thing? Is there corruption? What's happening? And all of that. And we have this, it's called the, I think it's Public Investment Accountability Committee. And it's part of the Revenue Management Law, which is a committee that has that mandate and has that obligation to actually tell the citizens at the end of every year how much has been collected, what the revenue goes into, and all of that. So there's constant communication and, should I say, interaction with the citizens. So that mitigates any apprehension on the side of the citizens and also the government, or should I say even the investor, because everybody is sort of in the loop or in the platform. So that's basically Ghana's experience.
That's really, really interesting that what you're saying basically is that transparency and access to that information has created kind of a level playing field in terms of like information distribution, and that civil society actors are relatively satisfied at the moment and reassured, as you said, about the deals. I mean, in the I think it was in July or in August, a number of groups in Ghana were questioning of a particular petroleum project and whether this represented a fair deal, as we said, using information that was out in the public domain. And it did lead to kind of a controversial exchange, right, between some of those NGOs and the government and others. I mean, what would you make of that exchange and public debate that was very much alive in Ghana? I think it was back in August.
Yeah, I think back in August. So you see, like I mentioned earlier, once you create that platform, the access to the information is there. The debate on whether is it good, is it bad, it tones down, it slows down, the pace, it tones down, but at least you get that, feeling that you can speak about it because you know about it. When you don't know about it is another, it goes into another dimension. But when you know about it and you're able to, speak to it, discuss, it sort of also gives, should I say, it regulates the radar in the sense that if there was some acceleration, there's a step back to say, well, let's see what it is. And then of course, you since you're following, you realize that Ghana always has a very vibrant opposition. Whoever is in opposition is very loud and very vibrant. So all those checks and balances, sort of allows for the process to get to some, consensus, because there's always not going to be a 50-50 balance, but at least, you're not too far off from what people's expectations are. So I think that basically that's what we veered into. So I won't say it was too much of a very off situation. Everybody had their role to play, It's a democracy. You speak, I speak. I say don't speak. You say I'm entitled to speak. But the debate flows on. I mean, it goes on. There's no issue of you spoken, so you're gagged for life. No, you speak. I speak. I say don't speak. I say I'm supposed to speak. Don't allow me to speak. And anybody says what they. So that environment allows for, like I say, the radar to keep going back and forth. It doesn't go into the red and stays there. It moves back and forth, till there's a balance, either way that you see. So that's basically all that.
Thank you. Thanks. So we are coming towards the end, not yet, but towards the end. So I'd like to, Carla and Rob and Meliana, please feel free to answer that question around how do we take that conversation, beyond kind of the usual suspects. But also I throw another question in the mix for you to answer if you want, is that we're almost 2 weeks away from the beginning of a new year, right? Like we're all going off, hopefully in the next week for end of year celebrations. If you're thinking of 2022, like what would be the most important thing you would want to see happening in 2022 regarding contract disclosure? Like what would be kind of your dream, like achievement, either in your respective countries, in Ghana, in Mexico, or in Indonesia, or globally? Like what would be a great breakthrough globally on that agenda? So I don't know who wants to go first. Yes, Nana.
I'll go first. Because we have practiced it for some time now. So basically, from the government's perspective, we haven't seen any downturn per se, since we published the contracts. But the one, should I say, challenging issue or recurring issue that comes up is that usually the contracts are signed in periods. I mean, from the history of what we have, they're done in periodically. The latest being the ones that are flowing from the license round. So everybody is looking to what was in the old contracts and expecting that it translates in the new contracts. But mind you, in between those phases or those ages, if I can use that word, there's been transformation, one, in the global industry, the global petroleum industry. There's transformation in country, nationally. There's transformation even within the investor segments. So then it becomes, quite problematic if you want to, if you want to go on a different tangent or, just a little shift. So what we would expect is, that the narrative from, for instance, the CSOs would urge companies to go with the flow or go with the trend. I think that the more important issue is whether you're being treated fairly. It's the equitability. If you came in this period, would you get the same terms or conditions in the contract that X company would get? So that they don't think that a contract that was signed, should I say 10 years ago, should be the same terms. See, that sort of creates a bit of a problem. So once that narrative goes with publish your contracts, but also from the investor side, know that the trends or the terms go with the trends globally and also nationally, then it makes things easier, because otherwise that's also a setback. And it's also one other should I say, one other problem that, or challenge that any government will say, look, if I publish it, they're going to think that I can't change, I can't move, I need my space to be able to operate. So I think that that's one thing that we would need that narrative also, so that there's a balance, that contracts evolve, terms, conditions, indicators and not everything else evolves. So we need to make sure that it goes with the flow, it transforms with that process. Otherwise, there's a bit of a challenge there, because
so
especially also
the understanding that terms and conditions in contracts can be renegotiated as circumstances evolve, right, in the sector and in the country. Nana, I'm gonna have to cut you off because I only have 5 minutes left before I give the floor to Aubrey, but I want to hear from Carla, Rob, and Meliana as well for their closing remarks. So thank you so much, Nana. That was a really important point. Rob, do you want to go next? And then I'll take Meliana.
I'm more than happy to go next. So I want to actually very quickly respond to Nana Akua's point. I think it was a really good one. And it is challenging, because I think at the heart of what she was saying is that in many respects, civil society, the media, people don't understand the industry sort of that well, and as a result it means that people misunderstand, they get angry about things that maybe there is a rational sort of explanation and a reasonable sort of cause for, and to that point, I just want to say that civil society and the media can't get sophisticated unless they have access to the information. And I think we are seeing in countries like Ghana that these, civil society is getting stronger. Their ability to understand, their ability to analyze is really shooting up through the roof. So I hope that she agrees too. So I just wanted to say then on what I want to see in 2022. I think what I'm really excited about here is NRGI, together with Publish What You Pay and Oxfam, we're actually doing an analysis of all of the EITI countries who've now had a year to be implementing that new EITI policy. And so we're really going to dig in and look to see the degree to which countries are really like actually following that rule or not, and also what kind of norms are developing. So how broadly are people applying this contract transparency rules? Are they just sticking to the main contract document? Are they also including environmental and social documents in addition to that? What's the standard here? And so we'll be doing that, something to look out for come sort of April, May sort of time. So yeah, that's my exciting thing.
Great, thanks. Yes, we're all looking forward to that. Meliana, would you like to go next?
Yes, I want to respond from the Public OGP Madagascar too, how to create the public demand for the contract disclosure. At least we as the civil society have to convey that the importance of the contract being open and what is the benefit for the society, try to bring the contract information near to the real life impact. So what is the impact for if the contract not open, maybe corruption or not fair deal that will be impact to the development agenda in respective countries, like health, education sector maybe, because we have to bring the narrative that revenue from the mining activities should be optimized for development agenda than benefiting the for the society. And for the important thing that I want to look in 2022 for the contract transparency, it can be for Indonesia or maybe global, I think. My hope is regarding the issue is we should have moved that there will be no more debates regarding whether the contract can be open or not, because it's time for everything to be open, because this is the time for the openness and it's time for disclose the deals, I think. Thank you.
I like that tagline. Thank you. Carla.
Sí, estoy de acuerdo con Meliana
Yes,
también.
I agree with Miliana as well. Before anything, I would like to comment that we have also positive experiences. I know that I talk about many challenges before, but thanks to OGP, the planning of the mining projects is public. 20% of the Mexican territory was granted to companies and nobody knew where to find that. So I think one of the wishes for 2022 is perhaps to systemize the good practices on transparency on the different industries, because bad practices allow contradictory policies. This darkness is impacting on all the citizens, but also on the state. So it is this is generating chaos, and so this does not allow us to monitor our natural resources. So we need to empathize and be aware that there are many communities that are affected. The environmental liabilities are long term. So the flux of capital goes to the ultimate profiteers. So if this was having a good effect on all the communities, this should be disclosed. So if you are not disclosing, it's because you are not profiting or giving up benefits to the whole community. So we hope for 2022 to have the disclosure not only of the contracts but also all the files. Thank you very much.
That's great, thanks. So I'm glad to hear we have high ambitions for 2022, and thanks also Carla for sharing that amazing number that OGP contributed to making public that 20% of the territory in Mexico was licensed to mining, and people didn't really know where. So I think that's an amazing achievement of OGP to making that information transparent and publicly available. Great. So we're coming towards an end. We have like about just 7 minutes left before the end of this panel, which I think was really interesting. And I think it was great to have all these different perspectives. So I'm now turning to my colleague, Aubrey Menard, for closing remarks and trying to kind of bring all that together. Aubrey is a Senior Policy Advisor for Extractive Industries Transparency at Oxfam America, a very long time friend of Publisher IP, the EITI and OGP. So Aubrey, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Elisa, and thank you everyone for your super interesting comments and discussions today. I especially liked some of the questions that came out of the chat. I think it really livened up our discussion. So I've been furiously taking notes over here, and I just want to maybe frame contract disclosure a little bit and then sum up what I was hearing today. So with the energy transition upon us, more countries will be coming online as producers of mine resources. And when it comes to resource governance, we cannot repeat the same mistakes in different places. With the energy transition, we have the opportunity to avoid the resource curse and for citizens to actually benefit from their natural resources. And the key to this will be transparency. Contract disclosure is an indispensable piece of the transparency puzzle. As you may know, there's been a lot of global progress over the past decade on payments to governments disclosures through EITI and through different countries' laws. These disclosures tell us how much companies are paying to governments in exchange for their natural resources. But payments to governments disclosures only give us part of the story. Through these payments to governments disclosures, we know how much companies are paying in the best case scenario. They don't tell us how much companies should be paying, and we need contract disclosure for that. Contract disclosure is key to making sure that payments match what is expected, but they are also critical for citizens' decision-making. Citizens need to be able to hold their governments accountable for getting fair deals on their behalf. And with increasing number of assets being stranded, they also need to be able to engage in the discussion of whether resource extraction is worthwhile and in line with the country's climate change priorities. Moreover, contracts may and should contain provisions around gender or consultation of Indigenous communities or environmental commitments, for example. And it's important that citizens are able to make sure that what's promised is actually happening. Today, we heard some good news on the transparency front. As Rob told us, this is a very exciting time for contract disclosure. Countries and companies are making new commitments in this area. Just last week, the ICMM committed to contract disclosure, which brings us up to 42 companies with public policies on this, and this marks a huge change in the private sector. But as we heard from Richard, contract disclosure isn't always straightforward. The term sets off alarm bells on commercial concerns on some companies' minds, with some companies, and as Meliana emphasized, there are a lot of questions about exactly what parts of contracts have to be disclosed. Another issue can be that some companies, especially smaller ones, do not disclose their beneficial owners, and beneficial ownership disclosure is another key piece of the transparency puzzle. But ultimately, as we heard from Nana, as well as Richard, transparency is good for business. From the company perspective, it can improve their social license to operate. And from the government perspective, it both mitigates citizen suspicions on whether the government is doing a good job of giving out what belongs to them, and attracts investment by showing that there's a level playing ground for business. But what happens to the data once it's disclosed? As Carla told us, it's important to build monitoring groups so that the data is not just, as she said, quote, kept in a drawer. Even if it's public, if information isn't understandable and engaged with, it won't be useful. And to this point, Nana told us about the lively debate that takes place in Ghana, especially around local content because of the disclosures that are available. So to use a popular American, like a very American phrase, it comes from a movie, we say, if you build it, they will come. So if we get this data out there, that's just the first step. And it's going to take a while for people to come around to the fact that this data is out there in the public, in the public domain. But if you build it, eventually people will start engaging with it and it'll push for better outcomes. And finally, I want to close by reiterating a point made by Carla, which is that unfortunately, when it comes to transparency, If provisions are recommendations rather than requirements, they're routinely ignored. It's therefore crucial that transparency measures are codified into countries' laws, company policies, and into the policies of international organizations, such as we've heard about in the EITI or in the ICMM. Once these requirements are in place, we can turn to addressing the implementation gap, as Rob mentioned, and making sure that citizens can make their resources help achieve their country's development goals. So again, I want to thank you all for your participation. As we see with the energy transition, we have an unprecedented opportunity to get this right. And I thank you all for being part of a discussion on how we can do that and how we can avoid remaking these mistakes of the past again. So thanks again, and I'll turn it over to Elisa just to close us up.
Thanks, O'Brien. Thanks for your outstanding summary of the key points that were shared during this webinar. Thank you very much, Nana Akua. Thank you, Carla, Rob, Meliana. It's very late for you. I think we've touched upon a lot of the critical points around disclosure of contracts in the extractive sector and how OGP can help strengthen that global norm around transparency in the oil, gas, and mining sector. Thank you to our translators, and thank you to you, members of the audience. Please continue to follow that conversation and that evolving norm with hashtag Disclose the Deal, which is the global campaign by Publish What You Pay members in more than 50 countries to get mining licenses and petroleum contracts out in the open for citizen oversight. Thank you very much and have a great continuation of this OGP Summit this week. Bye.